Ministers off the hook really with all these little pie-in-the-sky announcements to try and put a sticky plaster over a gaping wound. But what we really need is sufficiently resourced prisons that have good staff that are well remunerated and are kept in the job so that they gain experience and they stick around, so that they are doing the security aspect of the job, finding parcels, tracking down prisoners that are building links to the outside. But it also could be some capital expenditure on prisons as well. A lot of the older prisons have got windows that have gaping open ventilation, whereas the modern prisons now have a special vented type window as well, so they could fit cages over the existing windows, or they could replace the existing windows in prisons, and they could also invest in some anti-drone technology as well. So it seems like this is just an attempt to cover over the major issues we've got in prisons yet again, without actually focusing on the real issues and having a whole approach to the system, which is staffing, which is to eliminate the risk of any corruption, but also to eliminate the risk of all these smuggling routes and to have enough staff making sure security procedures are taking priority. The
example of the drone that we saw in our report was a small one being flown in under cover of night, and it would have seemed there was an open window at a particular cell and it got in. You're saying about more modern prisons having different types of windows so they couldn't get in. But I mean, presumably, it would normally be quite easy to spot when something is being flown into a prison, wouldn't it?
Well, absolutely not. I mean, a jail that I work at, for example, holds 1,300 inmates. You have less than 15 staff operating of a night time within that prison, and they will be based on a wing where there's perhaps 200 prisoners that have got TV sets playing, who are making noise in their cell. So listening to a drone approaching one window on the outside is virtually impossible. The camera systems are often inoperable, or there's nobody manning those camera systems, or in jails where they haven't got that, they simply haven't got anyone patrolling the outside areas, keeping an eye on drones coming over. So it's very hard to actually gauge how much drones are being used to smuggle.
What would you say would be the right level of staffing? I mean, at 1,300 inmates, 15 staff, how many staff do you think there should be overnight?
Well, we've obviously campaigned for a long time to say that staffing levels are extremely low. Since 2010, we've seen a 30% cut in frontline staff. We certainly think that needs to be put back in place. We need the right resourcing in place, and we need staff that are tackling those very grave security issues that we've got going on at the moment, because it's not just obviously drugs that we're worried about, it's serious weapons, and this could lead to escapes and other incidents within the prison system.
And what are your views on staffing levels and how much they contribute to what's going on, John Podmore?
Well, I agree with Mike. The staffing levels are way too low. The cutbacks were too severe and too quick. And the answer is in staff-prisoner relationships. If you want intelligence about anything in a prison, about drugs, about mobile phone, about corrupt staff, that comes from well-trained, well-motivated, well-paid prison officers who know their prisoners, who are communicating with their prisoners and gaining intelligence from that. You know, numbers are an issue, but more important than numbers are the relationships. And I think a chasm has opened up in those staff-prisoner relationships because of the severe cutbacks and the low levels of morale in the service at the moment.
John Podmore, Mike Rolfe, thank you very much.
Work. He's called James Almond and he worked at Stocken Jail in Rutland. He's been speaking exclusively to our Home Affairs correspondent Danny Shaw for Radio 4's File on 4 programme. And what did he tell you, Danny?
Well, what he told me is that he got a job at Stocken Prison via an agency, and he was initially recruited to do non-prisoner facing roles. He was actually escorting building workers who were renovating Stocken Prison in Rutland, so he had no contact with prisoners at the start. And then his role developed, and he started having to guard prisoners, to guard the classrooms where they were taking courses, and do some random searches of prisoners. And during that time, he got talking to an inmate, and they started chatting about football and stuff like that. And eventually, the conversations developed, and this inmate started to tell him that he wanted him to bring in mobile phones. This is what he told me on File on 4.
I did feel fairly vulnerable in the role, especially as at the time I was suffering very heavily with depression after my father had passed away. And that's the kind of thing that these prisoners can pick up on quite easily. They can see when your moods are low. They have a lot of time to think. Kept asking daily and become aggressive with things he'd say as well. I know where your family lives. I'll have somebody follow your auntie around. I'll have them hurt your auntie. He really scared me with those threats, especially when he said, well, I know about your niece and nephew.
So those threats really worried him, and James Almond eventually gave in to those threats, and he agreed to bring in a mobile phone for the prisoner. He got £500 for taking the package in. It's possible that package also contained the potent synthetic cannabis spice. He never looked inside it, but it's possible that it did contain drugs as well. And then more parcels followed as well. In total, he took in 4 packages for this prisoner. He says it was easy to get the parcels into prison.
There was that point, am I going to get somebody coming to my house? This gentleman was in prison for armed robbery. I didn't know what he was capable of. In 6 months there hadn't been a staff search, so taking that phone into the prison, it was a calculated risk that wasn't going to be the day they decided, well, we need to do a staff search. I was trying to just play it nice and cool and just be normal walking through the gate.
Well, he was eventually caught. The conversations he was having with the prisoner aroused suspicions amongst his colleagues, and he was brought in front of the governor. He confessed and he was sentenced. He spent about 3 months in prison. He's now managing to rebuild his life, however.
OK, thank you very much. To talk more about corruption in prisons, 3 people with experience on the front line. From Bristol, John Podmore was a prison governor at Brixton, Belmarsh and Swaleside jails and led a national unit tackling corruption. He describes corruption in prisons as an inconvenient truth. Also with us, Tracy McMahon, who founded the She Project, working with women transitioning out of jail, and says the stories of contraband are rampant. And Mike Rolfe, who is a prison officer at HMP Elmley and the national chair for the POA, the Union for Prison Officers. Dan, if you want to join us over here. OK, John Podmore, then, how serious is this issue of corruption in our jails?
I think it's a very serious issue, and I think it's something it's a problem that's getting worse as we've lost more and more staff and we've lost a lot of experience.
And what do we need to do about it?
Well, first of all, we need to acknowledge that there's a problem, and that's not an admission of failure. I mean, there's corruption in the media, there's corruption in banking and sport. Why wouldn't there be corruption in prison? So we need to wake up and smell the coffee. But we need much more in the way of training, and we need much more in terms of resources to investigate staff and prisoners that we're suspicious of.
OK, let me bring in Mike and Tracy then. Mike, as a prison officer, how often are you and your colleagues pressured to smuggle stuff into jail?
Well, it is true that there's obviously periods where prisoners will try it on with a variety of stuff.
Has it happened to you?
Yeah, of course.
Well, go on, give me a typical conversation then.
It's 9 out of 10 times it's a joke. Most of the time they come up to you and say, "Here, do you fancy bringing me in a phone? I'll give you some money." And it starts off as a jokey sort of conversation like that. However, most prison staff are trained very well to deal with that, and I don't accept that it's rife within prisons. Most prison officers turn up there because they're honest, they have integrity. And the last thing they want to do is see corruption within prisons. They're there to turn people's lives around, not to get involved in corrupt acts.
The estimate, Danny, I think is around 5 officers for every prison is potentially corrupt. Is that right?
I don't think anyone's saying it's rife. The vast majority of prison staff act with integrity and professionalism. Mike's absolutely right. But there's a small minority, and they have a disproportionate effect on the stability of prisons. And I think the working assumption, I was told by one very well-informed source, was that in every prison across England and Wales, 3 to 5 staff are corrupt, and that equates to around 600. But that's out of a total workforce of around 33,000. Sure.
Tracy, you work with female prisoners every day. What are they telling you about contraband inside?
It's not conversations that sort of they naturally emerge from women who often come back to East Lancashire and have known each other prior to going into prison. So these conversations naturally emerge. And from what we're hearing, and for anybody that knows about the prison estate, the women's prison estate makes up 5% of the population. So it's a very scattered, fractured estate. So, but the women that are coming back through the gates, who have often served short sentences, and I think we've got to also look at the fact that, yes, there is a staff problem, but it is I do agree with Mike here, there's a very small percentage. The prison officers that I've met are dedicated, hard-working.
Yeah, but what are the women telling you?
Well, the women are telling us it comes in through the post, through visitors, and, you know, to sort of counteract what we are saying about the staff corruption, we're getting it from visits and through mail, where, you know, drugs are coming in. Not only that, prescribed heroin replacement, Subutex, is also what we call is currency within the prison estate. So those are going round selling for large amounts, particularly Subutex, because it's easier to sort of transport from one person to another than, say, a liquid methadone.
Substance, yeah. Mike, you don't, my understanding is you don't need formal qualifications to become a prison officer. You can join at 18. The training lasts 10 weeks. Is that enough?
Yeah, the training does equip you, to be fair, and you won't find any sympathy for anyone that behaves corruptly from fellow prison staff. We all try to turn up to do that job with integrity, as Danny says, but when someone undermines that, actually, that is a real demoralising effect for every member of staff. And I think Tracy touches on some valid points there. You know, there are a variety of ways that drugs come into prisons, and actually prisoners sometimes will blame prison staff, even when it's not prison staff that have led to the trafficking route, because it's a distraction away from the real trafficking route, such as a drone, such as visits, such as parcels over the wall. So they're blaming a member of staff because there's two reasons. One, it takes the focus away from what their activities are and puts the focus on the prison staff instead. But also, two, because then that negates any sort of charges that they may have coming towards them, because the issue has to be investigated. You're several months down the line, and then no charges are brought against the prisoner.
John Podmore, having been a prison governor at 3 prisons, have you come across people who joined the prison service in order to make money this way, i.e. by, you know, being paid to smuggle in stuff into prisons?
Yes, I carried out an investigation when I was at Brixton, and someone joined. He had been a prisoner in Wandsworth 2 years beforehand. He was also an illegal immigrant. But those cases are relatively rare. I think what Danny's programme has highlighted is the vulnerability of staff. And Mike talked about training. I would disagree with him. Prison officer training in 10 weeks is the shortest in the world. But we should also bear in mind that prison staff, it's not just people in uniform. The prison workforce is quite varied and complex. It's doctors, teachers, nurses, drug workers, chaplains, and I don't think any of those get any training at all to help them resist the conditioning and the manipulation and the threats that are highlighted in Danny's programme.
OK, thank you very much, everybody. Danny, let me ask you before you go, the latest prison figures we've got out.
These are prison figures compiled by the Council of Europe, and what they show is that Britain imprisons more people than virtually any other country in Europe, apart from Russia and Turkey. These are the sort of around 45 countries in the Council of Europe. The imprisonment rate is also well above average. That's the rate per 100,000 of the population. And interestingly, a high proportion of those in jail in England and Wales are sex offenders, people sentenced for violent crimes, and also life sentence prisoners, very greater numbers in the UK than elsewhere.
Examining the government's plans, many critics say the biggest question they need to address is, does prison work? Let's address that one. And Sarah, as you mentioned earlier on, working in prisons, in the field of criminal justice, mentoring women in custody as well. We've got more prisoners in this country than any other in Western Europe. And as to the European region, if you want to call it, as a whole, only Russia and Turkey have more. Some of these statistics here are stark and astonishing. Why is this happening?
Well, we've got more people, we've got double the number of people in prison now than we had 20 years ago.
And crime rates are going down.
And the crime rates are going down, and so much of this is directly the result of policy. And as Bob Neal, the chair of the Justice Select Committee, said on Wednesday at the start of that session, it is a wide consensus now that the prison system we have is in crisis, and that is quite significant for the Conservative chair of the Justice Select Committee to say that. We know it doesn't work. It doesn't work by any measure. It doesn't work for victims of crime. It doesn't work for us as a society. It certainly doesn't work for the people in it when you have the scale of the rioting and the frequency of the rioting, you know, which is unprecedented, really, since Strangeways 25 years ago.
Peter, it was a while since you were in, wasn't it?
Yeah.
But it was pretty bad then. And you were just saying beforehand when we were having a cup of coffee, it's even worse now.
Yeah. So my first prison sentence was at 14 years old, and I was a regular attender until my early 30s. And not at any point did prison serve as a deterrent or as an intervention to support my rehabilitation. And, you know, since getting released and working in the community with people that are getting out of prison, the stories that I'm hearing now are just, it's getting scarier and scarier and scarier. And the challenges that people are facing about settling into the community after release from prison are just showing that the work that's taking place within a custody setting isn't supporting people to get to a point where they can manage themselves in the community, which encourages them that cycle of offending again and then back into custody.
Are they just too brutal as places? Do we need to change our entire philosophy?
I'm not sure whether they're brutal, but there's examples around the world, and there is good practice going on within the custody setting. There's initiatives going on that I'm aware of where, you know, people that are studying in universities in the community going in prisons to study alongside prisoners, and that's really breaking down some of the barriers and the stigma that people are carrying about that. So there is good interventions that's going on. But I think on the whole, there isn't enough, and that isn't consistent enough, and those links into the community support networks aren't consistent enough. I provide a mentoring service now, and we're working with people to kind of address how they identify themselves. You know, if we can get somebody to see themselves as somebody who actually will fit within society, that isn't just an offender or isn't just a substance misuser, then we can support them to raise their aspirations and take up those valued roles.
Angela, you'll be interested in this. In Norway, prisoners are allowed all manner of comforts, a much more lenient regime in a way that would send some of our popular press apoplectic. But the reoffending rate here is 60%. The reoffending rate in Norway is 20%.
Okay, well, you can do anything you want with statistics.
Well,
interpret. Okay, so if those are what the statistics say, that's what they say.
More lenient regimes.
Well, I don't think so. As far as I'm concerned, prison has 4 basic functions. Yes, there is an element of rehabilitation. We want to feel that people have somehow learned something from the so-called sobering experience of prison, and they can come out as a better person and hopefully won't reoffend. We hope it'll be a deterrent. But we also hope that it will keep the members of the public safe. And the fourth thing is anybody who has committed, certainly a violent crime, should have their liberty taken away from them in a way that makes them feel the punishment. Now, you know, at a very, very simple comparison, if you jump a red light, you have to either do a speeding course or whatever, get points on your licence. You feel it, and afterwards, if you have been done for speeding, you tend to watch the clock a bit more. It has to be made to feel that if you have been, thankfully I haven't been inside.
That's loss of liberty. In a much more lenient prison regime in Norway, they have 20% reoffending rates.
Well,
what's your conclusion, other than saying, oh, well, statistics can tell you anything?
My conclusion is still that the fact is that if prison, first of all, people who commit violent crime, as I say, have to be taken off the street, right?
And how do you stop them committing violent crime when they come out?
As members of the public, well, some people, you can hopefully rehabilitate them. Some people will be sobered up by the experience of prison. I would have thought that somebody who is locked up wouldn't want to go through that again. But if they are given an iPad and Amazon orders and a la carte food or whatever it is that goes on in British prisons, is not going to encourage them to not reoffend.
Well, I'm sorry, but prisons are actually exceptionally painful, irrespective of the kind of conditions that a person was to live in, because prisons are all about the waste of life and the consciousness of time, the sense of loss, the estrangement from family members. These are all absolutely fundamental and essential to how a prison works. Now, you may well have other aspects, for example, around very austere regimes, very punitive regimes. You may have restrictions in terms of access to all sorts of different things, like educational resources. But prisons are profoundly painful. People really do feel, and that's why we have such a high rate of death in prison. We have currently you know, one of the highest rates ever in prison deaths in terms of self-inflicted deaths. Last year, 113 prisoners in England and Wales killed themselves in prison, and there's still 57 awaiting classification, so that number will go up. Since 1990, there's been more than 1,900 self-inflicted deaths.
Do
in
tough
prison.
regimes work as a deterrent?
Tough regimes do not work as a deterrent. There is no evidence that actually a tougher regime will actually lead to the slightest bit of decrease. In fact, what works is when we actually try and help people and invest in them. Not
Belinda, do you want to come in? Belinda?
The evidence does suggest that the longer people are in prison, the less likely they are to reoffend. And the numbers of deaths going up, I think, I think has coincided with slightly greater liberalisation. And what you have happening is that the prisoners themselves have more freedom, that like the really hardened ones, I think, are ruling it over the perhaps slightly more there's a lot more bullying because there could be a slight, I don't know if authority vacuum is the right word, but one thing a stronger regime will do will be prevent that bullying which happens inside prisons, which probably contributes towards the rates of suicide.
Okay,
Sarah.
So a few things. We have a prison in this country with a reoffending rate of 20%. It's HMP Grendon. It's a therapeutic community. If you want to look at what works, you don't even have to go abroad. You have to be there. You have to be sentenced for 2 years or more. It's an intensive therapeutic community. On the highest recorded rates of prison death across the piece, including self-inflicted deaths, it directly correlates with a benchmarking exercise in 2012. You can see it drop off. The prisons become more overcrowded, they are understaffed, and you can see all the graphs for the funding do this. The rates of violence, assaults on staff and suicide goes up.
£70,000 a year, well, £35,000 a year, up to 70 to
As for
keep
a
a
la carte food, £1.81 usually. That's what some prisons are spending on a whole day's food, so people are malnourished, the impact that has on behaviour, and the idea that there's plenty to do. Many people are currently in their cells 23 hours a day. 23 hours a day. That is why there are riots and this huge increase in violence and self-inflicted death.
Nick Rolfe, Chairman of the Prison Officers Association. Hi, Mike.
Hiya. Morning. Yeah, I've listened to some of that debate, and I've got to say that prisons aren't oppressive anymore. People have this view that prisons are still stuck in the 1950s, where prison officers go around giving someone a clonk when they step out of line. It really doesn't work like that anymore. Prisons are actually very short-staffed. You have wings in closed establishments of 200 prisoners where they've got 3 members of staff trying to control that. There's no way 3 members of staff could be oppressive and maintain the levels of discipline that people are trying to allude to there. What you actually have got is prisons run on appeasement, and what they run on is prison officers that have a way and ability of controlling and managing people without having to show that and enforce it unless someone steps out of line.
If there were fewer prisoners there, the whole thing would be easier to manage.
Well, overcrowding is a problem, and actually some of the prison population is a problem as well, because we put people who should be in mental hospitals in prison nowadays because we cut the funding in the NHS. So there is a concern around the population that we're actually housing within prisons, and we need to help. There are interventions for those people. They're not sufficient. I do agree that people do spend too much time behind their doors, but you do need to have security and discipline. That is absolutely fundamentally important. And what you've got at the moment is because you've got staff that haven't got the numbers to be able to maintain control and order, you've got prisoners maintaining control and order, and they're not the people that you want to have control and order. And that causes the violence, the drugs and all the problems we've got in prison. So we need to resource it properly, and in the long term that will benefit society and will benefit prisons.
Do prisons work? Lady in the pink. Let's go around the audience and see what they think. Hello.
Hello there. In my view, a punitive prison system does not work. Therefore, we need to take a much more liberal approach. And believe it or not, there are countries in the world that serve as perfectly good examples. I would also like to advocate the Norwegian prison system as a model. Their prisons are not overcrowded. Their main objective is to reintegrate those who have been excluded from society back into society.